So yeah, we'll start off by talking about what we mean when we say facilitation. And the examples that I'm giving and what I'm talking about is generally kind of facilitation in organising group spaces. But I think there's a lot of crossover with various different groups. So don't worry if that doesn't exactly apply to your context. I'm sure that facilitation is a word that we're all familiar with. We've probably facilitated meetings or at least been in spaces where there's been a designated facilitator. I was going to pause and hear what you all meant by what facilitation meant to all of you. But I think for the purposes of time, I'm going to skip that bit. But if anyone wants to pop in the chat while I'm talking, is able to multitask in that way, then feel free to share your own perspectives around what the phrase facilitation means to you. What I imagine would come up if we did do that activity of gathering what facilitation means to all of us is that it includes a whole host of different tasks, responsibilities, and roles. And I think generally when we think about facilitation at its most basic, it's an individual who's responsible for getting us through an agenda or a decision. And I think it's absolutely is that. It is part of facilitation, but it's often not the full picture. For starters, the role of a facilitator often goes way beyond simply guiding a group through an agenda or the content of a meeting. And a good facilitator will also be keeping on top of the more subtle group dynamics, like making sure that everyone feels included and able to contribute, balancing power dynamics, which have come up a lot already, fostering generative approaches to conflict, another thing that seems to be coming up a lot, and being aware of energy levels, generally kind of vibe checking the group, for lack of a better way of putting it. I really love this distinction that is from Seeds for Change, and they have a bunch of really useful resources on facilitation, which I've linked in the resources list. We're going to do such a whistle-stop tour that I'd really encourage you to dive into that all a little bit more, the resources from them and others. They've split these different responsibilities of the facilitator into tasks and maintenance. So tasks includes the more defined responsibilities, which tend to be a bit easier to wrap our head around. So it's what got done, what will change as a result of the meeting. For example, what action points were taken on, what decisions were made, and what problems were solved. It's essentially what would end up written down in meeting notes. And I would also include in this things like timekeeping, which is a facilitation skill that's easy to take for granted, but can really make or break a group's meetings. And I think in some ways is actually one of the hardest facilitation techniques and tools to master. And then maintenance refers to the softer and more difficult to define dynamics. So how did it get done? How did people feel? And how will this affect how they feel about the group? So for example, did the meeting make good use of pooled talents? Did everyone feel able to share their views? Was it enjoyable? Were conflicts addressed? And I would actually argue that this part is much more important for the overall health and sustainability of a group. Not getting through all your action points in a meeting is a little bit annoying, but it can be remedied. It's not the end of the world. But if people leave your meeting feeling like they were bored or left out or overlooked, or that the space is not one that they belong in, they're going to not come back, and you're really going to struggle to get people kind of repeatedly coming back to your meetings and engaging in your work. Which leads me on to more generally, why is facilitation important? I think it's not an especially glamorous or exciting topic. I imagine by the fact that you're all here, you think it's important. And I actually think it is quite exciting, but I imagine many would disagree. I really think that meeting facilitation is one of the main ways that a group can be made or broken, especially in kind of the early days of a group. But bad or unhelpful facilitation can be really, really damaging, and good meeting facilitation can be really, really powerful. So for example, good meeting facilitation, and I'm aware that this is a bit like binary, it's often like somewhere in the middle, but for the sake of the training, good meeting facilitation can make meetings more efficient so we can get through more stuff. It can increase clarity and decrease confusion, so people are clear of what decisions were made and what the action points were. It can decrease unhealthy conflict. I think conflict is in some ways inevitable and never going to get away from it completely, but good meeting facilitation can help that conflict be generative rather than unhelpful. It can help to balance power dynamics. As someone said, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it can definitely help. It can make groups more accessible, and I actually think this is one of the main and most important roles of a facilitator, is thinking about the accessibility of groups. And the session in a week's time is going to look at accessibility in a lot more detail. It can help to retain group numbers for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And it can make use of perspectives and skills in a group, which again, we already mentioned a little bit. If you're only getting the same people talking and only hearing from the same people over and over again, you're going to miss out on a whole like wealth of experience and perspectives and skills that are going kind of unvocalized or missed. And then on the flip side, bad meeting facilitation can lead to longer than necessary meetings, mean that action points and decisions aren't clear, people don't know what they're meant to be doing or what the decisions were. It can lead to unnecessary or unhelpful conflict. It can mean that informal power dynamics manifest and cause harm. It can make groups inaccessible. It can stop people from wanting to come back. And it can prevent you from hearing those really useful contributions that you might miss out on. So it's a bit of a rapid run through. I just wanted to give a little bit of a taste before we hear from you all. But hopefully it underlines why it's important that we're here today discussing it, why meeting facilitation is important to spend time thinking about. So we're going to go back into breakout groups. I'm glad there's been a lot of breakout groups, but as I said at the start of this series, there's going to be a lot of kind of peer learning, and I think there'll be a wealth of information and experience and perspectives in the room that we can learn from. So we're going to head in smaller groups, different groups this time, but again, 3 or 4 people to think about some real world examples for why meeting facilitation is important. You're going to be in groups of 3 to 4, as I said, for about 10 minutes. So we'll probably come back about 6:30, 48, but we'll give you a warning. Cool. Great. Can you see a slide that says tools and techniques? Great. So this is a very much incomplete list of tools and tactics that you might want to use to help with both the tasks and the maintenance side of facilitating a meeting. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with some of these. I'd really love to hear your thoughts as well. I'm just going to run through them briefly to have a look at them and kind of through the lens of how and why they can be helpful. So starting with check-ins and check-outs, I'm sure this is one that most of us are familiar with. We did it just at the start of our session today, and it's kind of become part of the furniture in most groups, I would say. So it might seem basic, but it actually serves really important functions, and several of them. An example being that it gives the facilitator an indication of the energy in the room, especially when it includes questions around how folks are doing. And it kind of lets the facilitator know if there's someone who's maybe particularly struggling with something or coming with like a really buzzy energy, and all of those things are really useful information to have at the start of a meeting. It also gives people an opportunity to get to know each other a bit better beyond just how you show up in meetings. So you can ask unrelated questions, which we did in the opening session. I don't know if any of you remember, but you could ask questions for like book or film recommendations or your favorite type of soup, or anything like that that kind of prompts that more like human connection. And potentially most importantly, check-ins offer a fairly low stakes and relatively accessible way for people to speak for the first time, which can then make it easier to speak up when it comes to more challenging conversations. And I found that I really, really noticed the difference in meeting spaces when there hasn't been a check-in at the start. It can feel like a waste of time, and if you've got loads to get through, you're like, oh, why do we need to spend 10 minutes on a check-in? Or there's loads of urgency to get through everything, but it really does pay off, I think, later on in a meeting. And then checkouts, I think, are slightly less common, but can also serve a really important purpose by giving an indication of how others experience the meeting, kind of allowing for a bit of a like check-in around what resonated, or people kind of sharing stuff that they take away. It's a reminder of what you discussed and what you might be kind of like holding going forward. So you can ask questions like one thing that you're taking away and do a go round, or you can ask an unrelated question. One that I really like is asking one thing that you're going to do to take care of yourself this evening or this afternoon or after the meeting, to kind of help folks transition out of the meeting space. And I think that's especially important if it's been a really kind of heavy conversation, or if you've discussed stuff that is kind of sensitive, or there's been conflict or anything like that. I think checkouts are really crucial. Breaking out into smaller groups Also something that I'm sure you've all experienced, or you have all experienced, because I've experienced it with you tonight. You see it kind of more in workshops and trainings than in meetings, I think, but it can also be a really valuable tool for facilitating meetings. That's because a lot of people find it much easier to have their say and contribute in smaller groups. So breaking out can help to hear voices that you otherwise wouldn't and have conversations that you otherwise wouldn't. Although I would say that this isn't always the case. I actually know plenty of folks who are much more comfortable speaking up in a larger group. Not me, but for some people. So it's important to get that balance. And breaking out into smaller groups can also let you discuss several things at once. So be an efficient use of time. Depending on the size and purpose of your meeting, you might have a lot to discuss that doesn't necessarily need everyone's input. So an example might be if you were planning an action, you could break into smaller groups with one discussing logistics, one discussing well-being and safeguarding, and one discussing kind of communication. But if you do that, you kind of just need to make sure that you have a way to feedback or keep a record from smaller groups for transparency and for clarity. But it lets people to kind of really get into the depth of stuff that they're interested in rather than sitting through lengthy conversations about stuff that actually they don't need to input into. So I think, yeah, maybe underutilized in meetings in my experience, but a really potentially useful one. Temperature checking. Again, a really simple tool, but a really helpful one. It's particularly supportive for facilitators themselves. It can be used in lots of different ways, but essentially you would use it in a situation where you need to quickly get an idea of what folks are thinking about an idea or a proposal, or just where the energy levels are. So for example, I could say I'm going to do a temperature check on the proposal to head straight back into breakout groups now without going through the rest of these tools. And I would ask you to give me a thumbs up if you agree, a thumbs down if you disagree, or like a wobble or something in the middle if you're kind of indifferent or you're not sure. If you're in person, you could also do this by asking folks to physically move around the room, which is called spectrum lines. And that can be really useful as a facilitator because it gives a quick impression of where people are at without the need for kind of loads of spoken input, which can kind of inform how you would proceed with the rest of the discussion. So if everyone agreed, then it's quite easy to look at where you would move forward. But if there was lots of disagreement, maybe you need to dig into it more. And then that leads us on to other hand signals. I'm not going to go through all the different ways that you could use hand signals because there's so many different approaches to them, but I will share resources that you could look at. I mean, some of the basic ones are just putting your hand up or like 2 fingers for a double point, or some people kind of wave for agreement. I would say if you're going to use hand signals, make sure you're all on the same page at the start about what hand signals mean. It's definitely led to confusion in spaces I've been in because people have such different approaches to using them. And also not everyone likes them. So it might be a useful one to include in your group agreement about how you're going to use them. Go-rounds are quite self-explanatory, but they can be a really helpful way to give everyone a chance to input. And that's particularly important if you've got some really dominant voices in the room. But keep in mind that not everyone might want to speak in a larger group, so giving an easy opt-out is helpful. And then similarly, asking for specific contributions does a similar function. It can be a balance or a way to balance contributions. And it could be as simple as asking for a contribution from someone who hasn't spoken yet, which I did earlier, or asking for someone from like a particular side of the room to speak, or a particular breakout group. You could also call on specific individuals if it's really noticeable that you haven't heard from someone, but I would be really careful doing that because it can feel really uncomfortable to be singled out. Both go-rounds and asking for specific contributions are super valuable tools at our disposal, but I think you need to kind of hold an awareness about people's comfort levels, and there's a really careful balance and kind of line to strike between balancing voices and power dynamics, but not putting people in an uncomfortable situation. That also links a lot to silence, which we've also practiced tonight. I feel like I'm giving you a little peek behind the curtain. Silence, I think, is a really underutilized and really important facilitation tool that we can be quite scared of. I'm definitely quite scared of it, and I find silence really uncomfortable. But for a lot of people, myself included, it can be really helpful to have that processing time, and not everyone can answer a question or come up with a contribution immediately. So asking a question and then either saying we're going to like sit in silence with it for 10 seconds, 15 seconds before anyone puts their hand up, or just after asking a question or asking for a contribution, giving space for silence, can be really scary, and feel really uncomfortable. But it's actually, I think, one of the most important facilitation tools that we can use. Really important for accessibility as well. Sharing the agenda in advance, not always possible, but there's lots of reasons to do it. Again, it's really important for accessibility. A lot of folks find it much easier to engage with a meeting if they know roughly what the content is going to be in advance. And beyond accessibility, you often find that you get kind of deeper conversations and contributions if you've shared an agenda in advance, because people have time to think about it and they come having kind of like an existing thoughts, or they know what to expect. I think it can also really help with timekeeping if you have people beyond just one facilitator who are aware of what the timings are for each section. And you could even ask someone else to help you with timekeeping if you struggle to do both at the same time. I've definitely done that in the past. But beyond that, just having the whole room or most of the room being aware of what the timings are can really help you to kind of like keep to that and move through the meeting in the way that you want to. Obviously with an element of flexibility, and agendas always change. But I think when possible, it's a really good one to try to stick to. And lastly, group agreements, which we've done in this space because we're together for a while. And I think there's a really careful balance to tread. I've definitely been in meeting spaces where we spent a really long time co-developing group agreements when actually we're not going to be together in a space for that long, and it can feel really time consuming. So coming with ready-made group agreements and asking people to commit to them is one way of doing it. Or if you're going to be with people for a really extended period of time, I think co-developing group agreements and asking for input is really nice. They also, I mean, they serve lots of purposes, but I think one of the main things is for you as a facilitator, having something to refer back to if you have to intervene in any way is really useful. One that comes up again and again is often in a group agreement, you have an agreement around sharing space and being aware of how much space you're taking up. And if you are having to kind of interrupt or intervene because someone is taking up a lot of space, it's really useful to have a kind of co-agreed group agreement that you can refer back to. And you're not just the kind of nasty teacher-like facilitator who's shutting down people. It's something that we've all agreed to together. And there's loads of stuff that you could put in there, which could be useful to refer back to. And then decision-making models as part of group agreements. We're not going to have time to go into these. You could easily spend a whole day or a whole week looking at different decision-making models. And as much as I would love to do that, we only have about 23 minutes left. But I more wanted to put this in here as a reminder and a suggestion to think about this in your group. I think having a collectively agreed way of making decisions is so invaluable for avoiding future conflicts or constructively moving through ones which do occur, and also with balancing power, which we've come back to a lot. I'm going to expand a little bit on that, like balancing power point, because I think we've come back to it loads of times. So what I mean by it, I think power dynamics exist in every group and in every interaction. They even exist in non-hierarchical organizing spaces. Surprise, surprise. So pretending that they don't exist doesn't mean that they go away. And I also don't think that power dynamics are necessarily bad. Like the role of a facilitator is in itself a power dynamic. And if you have a named power dynamic, a kind of leader of your group in some way, or someone who leads on a specific area, don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But I see the role of the facilitator is thinking about minimizing unhealthy and informal and unspoken power dynamics, especially those which relate to forms of oppression. And having a clearly agreed decision-making model is such an important part of this. If we haven't thought about how we make decisions and agreed on that, it's almost inevitable that informal and unwritten power dynamics will kind of take the place of that formal decision-making model or co-agreed decision-making model. For example, it will end up being the person who holds the most social power in the group, or the person with the loudest voice who's the most comfortable arguing their point, who ends up influencing the outcome of a decision. And I think good facilitation will think about this and how to integrate accountability mechanisms for the power that exists in the group. And part of that is an agreed decision-making model. I don't have time to run through these. I said I would finish this part at 10 past, so I would be opening a whole can of worms if I was going to go through all of these different types of decision-making model. But I will share resources, and I'd encourage you to spend some time looking into them and thinking about what might be most appropriate for your group. Or maybe you already have a decision-making model in place, but it could always be helpful to revisit it and make sure that it's working for you and that everyone in your group is kind of aware of it and on board with it and understands it as well. So often groups, I think, have decision-making models in place, but people don't actually know what they mean. So like boiling it down to its most simple form is a really useful way of kind of communicating that. You could also have different models for different types of decisions. So you might use majority rules, which is essentially voting to vote on what type of biscuits you have at your meetings, but then consent-based decision making when it comes to like bigger strategic conversations, like what your target is for the next year or something like that. Which is not to say that the biscuit decision isn't important, but each of the models can have a kind of different place in different circumstances. So you don't necessarily need to choose just one, but I would say have a think about it and talk about it in your group. Super useful and often overlooked. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see your faces. We've got about 10 minutes now to briefly put into practice some of the tools that we've spoken about.